Hi there, it's Nicole here today with a tone-on-tone, simple inked and stamped background. It's using white pigment ink against this Grout gray cardstock from My Favorite Things for a really subtle but really pretty background that highlights this adorable little deer from the brand new Friends in the Forest stamp set. This is part of the November release. I have trimmed down this square of Grout gray cardstock. Actually, I have a rectangle die cut trimmed to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and then a square that's 3 1/2 inches. And I am just taping it in place so that my design seamlessly goes from the background panel to the square. This card was part of the challenge this past Wednesday at My Favorite Things. Please see my blog post. It is linked in the supplies here under the blog post on YouTube. I am also taking a little white pigment ink then and inking up using the Drifts and Hills stencil from My Favorite Things to create my snowy border along that bottom edge. My Post-it tape is just simply to hold that in place. I'm going to be doing a little scoring and popping up this panel to give it a little more definition, but I still want my scene to go from the background to the square, if that makes sense. Now, all of these tree images I'm stamping with white pigment ink are from Friends in the Forest, and I'm going to stamp those repeatedly here just along my snowy border edge. One of my favorite things is creating a subtle background. It doesn't always have to take center stage. In this case, I wanted the little deer that I'm going to make into Rudolph to be the focal point of my design. And so I'm keeping all the rest of the elements very, very simple, very muted. And then the greeting strip is going to be a pop of color that kind of coordinates with the red that I'm going to make for the nose on the deer. Once I have everything stamped, I'm going to flip that square over, and a 1/2 inch in on all 4 sides, I am going to score a line. I flipped it over because I want the raised part of that to be on the front. And I'm using my Scor-Pal here to create that. And it's just going to create a little frame, add a little additional interest to that panel. So there's kind of what it's going to look like. I am going to take some foam tape then and pop this up. Now, when I'm using foam tape, I like to cover the whole panel because I don't want any indentations to happen. I buy a huge roll of Scor-Tape and I use it a lot. I do make a lot of cards since this is my job, and a roll of tape lasts me forever, even when I use a lot of the tape. So it's just one of those things that I personally like. You definitely don't have to use that much if you don't want to. I'm going to peel off the backing paper from my little square. And then I'm going to pop that right back in place, making sure to line it up with the background for that seamless scene. Now that I have the background all designed, it's time to do or add the focal point, the greeting, and add a little embellishment, and this clean and simple card will be finished. So I'm going to take some red cardstock from My Favorite Things. I'm going to take the greeting that reads, "You're a friend worth fawning over," and stamp that on the red cardstock with Versamark ink and heat emboss with white embossing powder. I think it would be fun to create a set of cards and use each of the critters from this, and you could use the sentiment that coordinates back to each animal. Or if you wanted to tip this whole thing over to the side and maybe not do a popped up panel or do a long skinny popped up panel, you could maybe even incorporate all of the animals if you wanted to do a little bit more in-depth type of scene. Lots and lots of great ways to use this set. I just love it. It has an adorable fox, a bear wearing a scarf, and then an owl, and of course this darling little deer. And his nose is just so prominent on the design. I really felt like it needed to have a little red nose. You could definitely do a little black nose as well. So there's my greeting cut into a thin strip. I'm just going to snip off the ends here, and then this is going to be popped in place right here over the top of my dimensional panel. Because it's a pretty thin strip, I usually like to use Scor-Tape because it's nice and thin. This is the 1/8 inch Scor-Tape, and it will fit perfectly behind my strip. This card is a little different for me since I usually start with the embellishment. I start with the coloring. I would say probably 90% of the time. And for this card, the background was what I wanted to get right, I guess. And I fiddled with it a little bit before I started this video, and for whatever reason, I just started with the background first because I wanted to see if that tone-on-tone white pigment ink would look as cool on the Grout Gray cardstock as I thought it would in my head, and I really liked it. I'm kind of anxious to try this again. Here is the deer stamped on some Nina Smooth cardstock, and I'm going to color it in really quickly and easily using my favorite color combination, one of my favorites. This is one I use a lot for critters, and I use it a lot for deer images. I don't know why. It's just one that I'm comfortable with and like. I tend to kind of stick to the colors I like. I know I talked about this in another video this week, and because of that, I feel like I end up liking the final result. This is E40, 43, 44, and 47. And then I'll use a little R00 for the cheeks, which I don't think shows up a lot. It just kind of pinkens the cheeks a little bit. It's a pretty muted pink. If you want it to stand out a little more, you might try R20. Because it's going over such a light color on the face, which is E40 mostly with a little E44 or E43 blended in, I didn't want it to be too bright. I'll also use R00 for the inside of the deer's ears. Once all of the coloring is done, all of the shading is done, and I did go back over it, I tend to err on the side of caution and go lighter and work my way up and add in some deeper, darker shadows as I'm going, because you can go over it as many times as you need to with Copic markers without pilling and ruining the paper. I am going to take a colorless blender and add some little dots to the back of the deer. And the colorless blender is not a blender. Instead, it's going to kind of wick away the ink, leaving lighter areas, which is going to add some fun interest to the back end or the back area of that deer. If you don't have a colorless blender or don't want to use a colorless blender, or you're using another coloring medium, a white pen used there would create a very similar look. I'm going to die cut the deer with the Coordinating Friends in the Forest dies. Pop my little deer in place here. Before I do that, I am going to take a black pen and go over his eyes and give them some detail and really make them pop. And then I can glue him in place. I kind of want to tuck the edges of his feet underneath the sentiment strip just a little bit. I'm using a little Ranger multi-matte medium to glue him down. Right there in front of that snowy scene. So super cute. The deer was my favorite image from this stamp set, so that's why I chose him. I'm going to take a little Nuvo crystal drops in Autumn Red. This is a little deeper, darker red than Red Berry. You could use whatever red you like. I tend to really like the Autumn Red. And then I'm going to take some Nuvo crystal drops in Simply White and add some little falling snow splatters or little drops all over the front of this scene to give the illusion of falling snow. Once this is done, I'm going to set this aside to completely dry. It needs a good 24 hours to completely harden those Nuvo crystal drops. And my tone on tone white pigment ink inked and stamped background card is all finished. Thanks for joining me today for this card featuring my favorite things, stamps, dies, and stencils. The supplies I used to create this card are listed and linked below the video here on YouTube. Here are a couple more videos featuring my favorite things that you might be interested in. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.